Hi, I'm Megan Patton, and today I would like to talk to you about our community water impact. It was a lesson that I completed with my students. There is a QR code up in the upper right-hand corner. If you would like any of the resources from today's PowerPoint or for this lesson, please feel free to scan it with your electronic device, and it will take you to a Google Drive folder with everything included. The links are also at the end of the project if you do not have an electronic device. Like I said before, my name is Megan Patton. I am from Carmichael's area school district. I currently teach integrated science 6 in our middle school classroom. I would like to talk to you a little bit about what is going to go on in this presentation and what I would like to talk about. So the first thing I'm going to do is just introduce you to a few things about why I did this project and what you're going to see. I'd like to talk to you about how the lesson works and also have some interactive activities that hopefully you can participate at home. A little bit about the planning process and the challenges and changes that I would make to this lesson if I were to do it again, and the lessons that I learned personally from doing this project. Our community's water impact was a lesson that I really was excited to teach. After working with the Grable Grant in our trainings, we talked about a postcard activity and how to creatively express our ideas and data in a form where it is more visually appealing, something that's very interesting for people to look at, something other than a bar graph, a pie chart, or a scatter plot. This lesson is really able to be changed for your needs. It can reach, I wrote it for grades 5 through 8, but you can add challenging activities or add a challenge to it to make it for higher grades, or you can also take out and give them a more structured feel for lower grades. It's very, very easily adapted to whatever age group that you are teaching with. So the first thing that I presented my students with was a glass of water. I set a glass of water on my table in the front of my classroom, and I was like, okay, guys, what does this mean to you? What is a way in your life that you use water regularly? And we talked about all of the different ways. So if I could ask you at home just to think of a way that you use water regularly, you can write it down. You can just remember it. We are going to use it later on in the presentation for your activity. So just think of some way that you use water regularly. Water is very important in our community. We have a lot of boil advisories. We have a lot of issues with our water authority. So the students are pretty familiar with the issues that are going on with our water because they see sometimes our water fountains are covered, or they know at home that sometimes they always can't drink the water out of the tap. Or when they see the streams and the rivers around our area, they see a lot of garbage and trash and things that should not be there. So we've been looking at the water cycle and our water systems, and we were pretty familiar with the uses of water. And I wanted a way to incorporate that environmental justice portion in a more creative manner. So during the Grable Grant, we did the postcard activity at the beginning, which was we decided on a question on our environmental impact and how we could present this data in a creative way. And we made graphs and different creative drawings with that so that it would be more visually appealing for our audience. Marty Schuyler was the right-hand man of Walt Disney, and he was an Imagineer. And a quote that I really like from him is communicate with visual literacy, make good use of all the nonverbal ways to communicate color, shape, form, and texture. And as we know, Disney is a very appealing company visually. They are really great at marketing items and making us want to buy them. We are a society of consumers. So this was a way for me to really relay, hey, we have water data. How can we make this visually appealing that anyone in our community would want to go through and read it and really be drawn into our data? So this is an example of my student work. I did remove the title because I would like for you just to look at this image and make some inferences about what you see here. I'm just going to give you a moment to look at this, kind of make a few inferences about what you think this chart might be about. So some of the things that this chart is, it only has 7 planets, and that was because she took data for 7 days. So each of those planets was a different day, and she talked about how many bottles of water that she used during that day. So red was 1 or 2, so she knew that she did not get the amount of water she needed for that day. 3 and 4 was like, okay, I got some, and 5 and above was where she got her required daily water intake. So you can kind of see, so she did Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And she kind of went through, and each planet was a different day. Now, this one I did leave the title on. I have a student who's very into 3D printing. She actually created our classroom mascots, as she calls them. So I have small 3D printed turtles, and she likes to draw comic strips. And this was really engaging for her because typically for making any data charts with labs and stuff, she's really, really not engaged. So she created a comic strip, and it was Mari the turtle and Luca the turtle, and they went on a picnic day together. And the bottles of water that they drank during their picnic day represented what she drank during her week. Now, as for our lesson, I'd like to kind of go through and talk to you about the process, really kind of show you how I did this. This lesson can span anywhere from like 4 periods to 6 class periods, however long you want to make it. It's super flexible and able to be adapted to any classroom setting. So I presented them, as I told you before, with a glass of water. And I asked them really like, what does this water mean to you and your community? Why is it important? What does it affect around you? What role does it play in your life? What are some things we do to use our water? What are some things we do to pollute our water? And what are some issues that we have with it? And right away, a lot of our students were like, yeah, we have those boil advisories. Like we can't drink our water at home. Or I see like when I go to the river in the summer and we go boating, I see a lot of trash floating around, and that's not great. And we talked about how we use water and how the ways that not only do we use it for recreational use, but we use it for so many ways of cleaning and drinking and cooking, and how important it is. So I then showed them the term environmental justice. My students are about 11 and 12 years old. They're typically not really that well versed in this term. Many of them had never heard of it before. So I made sure to give it like a green background to kind of stress that environmental type, because I know when I think environmental, I think green. And we talked about really what they meant. So we broke it down to, what does environmental mean? What does justice mean to them? And it was definitely something that was a little bit eye-opening to what they had thought before. Originally, they were like, oh, these are lawyers that go and fight for environmental issues. And we broke it down even further. And I was like, what does justice like truly mean? Is it just in a courtroom? What is it? So with our definitions coming together, we decided that to my 6th grade students, that environmental justice means giving everyone a fair opportunity to access the basic necessities like water, enjoying the outdoors of our environment. And with that, we then talked about, okay, so how can we stress this in our community that we need to give everyone equal opportunity for clean drinking water or for how we use water? And we talked about data. So my students are very pigeonholed in the fact that, okay, we're putting this data in a chart. All right, Mrs. Patton's going to ask for a bar graph, a pie chart, a scatter plot. What is she going to ask for? And I was like, you know what, guys? Let's talk about some non-numeric data. Let's talk about data that you can just collect anywhere. So we kind of broke it down. I asked them, I was like, okay, pick something that you could collect data on in a month. You have 30, 31 days. Like, what could you pick? We talked about it. Okay, how many times I go to the grocery store, how many times I eat out, how many times I play my video games, my screen time each week, all of these things they were kind of going through, and I was like, okay, so what are some things that we could pick it's maybe not so numeric, like things something else. And one of the students was like, what if the color of a piece of fruit for a month? What if I sat a piece of fruit out and we talked about the decomposition process? And I was like, that's really good. Like, and they talked about some other things that we could collect that weren't necessarily numbers. And then we talked about in a week. I said, okay, break it down even further. Let's talk about just a week, 7 days you have. What could you collect data on? And again, they talked about screen time and video games and how many times they ate out or how many times they ate lunch at school or all of those things. And I was like, okay, let's break it down. So they did a day and 24 hours. I was like, when you come back here tomorrow, what could you have collected data on? And then hour, I was like, what could you collect data on in 1 hour? Like if I let you go from this class and then you came back next class period, what could you have collected? And then we were like breaking it down to very small increments. And this is where they kind of got a little bit in an uproar about it. I was like, okay, 1 minute. They're like, what can we collect in 1 minute? Come on, Mrs. Patton. Like you can't collect anything in 1 minute. I'm like, yes, you can. So I told them to look around my classroom and think of something that they could collect data on in 1 minute. And they were surprised at the fact that there were so many different things that they hadn't thought of before as like data that they could look up or make a question out of it. So then I gave them this challenge, and I would like for you to do this at home if possible. So look around in the room that you're in, whether you're in a classroom, whether you're at home, and think of something that you could collect data for 30 seconds. My students had so much fun doing this 30-second activity. Some of them, I had one student who was dancing in the corner of my classroom and trying to see how many people noticed that he was dancing. Some of my students looked at him like he was crazy. They're like, are you really going to let him do this? I was like, yeah, that's his data. Or another student observed another one across the class and was trying to see how many times they blinked, how many times they heard other people speak, how many times they heard me speak, just how many times they could write things down on a paper, how many times they saw students outside of my classroom windows. They were really good about finding things that typically they wouldn't think about in a normal basis. So it was fun to do, and it was fun to get them starting to think about data and how they can collect it and how there's so much data in our everyday lives that they overlook. So then I asked them, I said, you're going to have 1 week, 7 days. What are 3 ways that you personally use water? And I want these questions to be something that you could collect data on. I want you to think of 3 ways. We shared these, we discussed these. I wrote a list on the board, and an adaptation that you can really make. For my more advanced class, I made each student pick a different question. So we wrote all of these up on the board, we talked about them, and each one had to pick their own individualized question. Whereas my classes that need a little bit of extra structure, a little bit more help, I allowed them, we kind of made a shorter list and we broke it down into 7 really good questions that they could collect data on. And I allowed them to choose one of those 7 questions. That way it was a little bit more structured. These questions were a little bit easier to gain data on, a little bit more for their level of thinking. Whereas my more advanced students had some really great things that they could think of. My one student went to the stream in her backyard every day, and she observed how if there was different trash in the stream, if different things had made it downstream. And she also looked at the amount of wildlife that she could find in the stream. And that was really, really great. A lot of my students chose to do how many times they refilled their reusable water bottle, how many plastic water bottles they used in a week, how long showers they were taking. And we talked about the amount of gallons of water in the showers. And we talked about washing dishes, because a lot of them have the chore of washing dishes or loading the dishwasher, how many loads of laundry they did. They were really focusing on those like household uses of water. So after they collected that 7 days of water, they put it in the chart. I gave them the chart. We came back from that week. It ended up being actually 2 weeks due to some scheduling and holiday breaks. But I showed them the slide as soon as they came in, and I was like, what's eye-catching to you? And I did also have a few brand names on their slide and that you can see in the lesson PowerPoint. And a lot of my boys are obsessed with cars and going on those car games like Need for Speed and Forza, and they're looking how to customize those really fancy cars. A couple of my students just got puppies, and a lot of them I have before lunch, so they're hungry, and I threw something sparkly on there, and I was like, what do you guys see on the slide that catches your eye? And they started like talking about it and talking about the different things and other things that catch their eye. And I was like, what about the background? Like, what do you think of when you see red? And they're like, stop. And I was like, yeah. Or like, notice me. I was like, absolutely. And I was like, so think about when you go to a store. And they were like, okay. And I was like, if every single cereal on that shelf was the same, but one had a clear bag, one had a brown box, and one looked like Lucky Charms, I was like, which one are you going to grab? And they're like, Lucky Charms. And I was like, absolutely. So I was like, look around at what you have on. I was like, find some brand names. And they were able to do that. And they're like, oh, and I was like, would you buy that same hoodie if it didn't have that symbol on it? And they're like, probably not. And I was like, exactly. So like, think about advertising, think about what's eye-catching to you, think about colors, think about things that people are interested in. And I told them, I was like, okay, we are going to take that 7 days worth of data and make it something visually appealing that appeals to you, that appeals to your classmates, that would appeal to the community, that would make them stop and look. And I showed them these 4 images and they were blown up on my screen. And I was like, this is all data. And they were like, what? And I was like, absolutely, this is data. So the first one, it's a little bit morbid, but it tracks the deaths of our world over a long period of time. And we talked about, it made it into flowers, and each flower color was a different, so we had Africa, Asia, Europe, North America, and South America. And we talked about why the 2 larger ones were the way they were, and why like this data might be important to somebody who is analyzing trends in populations in our world, and how that looks a little bit better than if they were sitting there looking at lines on a scatter plot or looking at bars on a bar graph. And they're like, no, absolutely. We see that this is more visually appealing. This is something that truthfully we would like to, we would look at. And I was like, okay, if you saw this in a magazine, it says fork it over. And I was like, what do you use a fork for? And they're like, eating. I was like, okay, so this was about the restaurant spending and whether they were declining or growing within the different types of restaurants. And I was like, they had it broken down by color, a sit-down restaurant, a fast food, and the declining sales that were going on there. And we had talked a little bit about the different like why they think the fast food were declining faster than the sit downs and things of that nature. And they were like, yeah, this is cool. Like, I see the brands, I see the colors, like it's simple. It's nice to look at. And then we talked about the baby boomers and how they identify themselves, and how instead of doing a pie chart, they made it into a person and they broke it down that way. And last but not least, 10 years of running. So first they were flabbergasted that someone could collect data that long. I was like, absolutely, like this is something that's ongoing. And the second they were like, this is cool. And they kind of played a little bit of like a cloud game, like what does it look like? Like you look at the cloud and say, oh, it looks like a bunny. And they loved looking at these. And we looked at a few more different ways of creatively sharing data. I shared mine from this project, and they were like, okay, we kind of get a feel for this. We understand like what we're supposed to do. So I have students who are more artistically inclined. They kind of think outside the box. So I did share some of theirs. The first one, she showed an eyeball, and the reason that she drew an eyeball was she said she wanted it to be eye-opening to the community. She wanted them to see what she was doing. And she was really throwing a lot of like puns in there, and I really enjoyed her thought process on why she chose it. But the tears that were coming from the eyeball were the amount of water that she drank. And if it was a good amount of water, it was teal. If it was not so great, it was yellow. And if it was red, it was like not a great day for how much water she took in. And then I have a student, she has a cattle farm and she shows a lot of cattle at 4-H and is very, very into her cattle lines and things of that nature. So she drew a cow and the spots on the cow were based on how many bottles of water that she drank. And the bigger days, she was like, I had sports that day. I drank more water. And she kind of like went through and saw like how much water she did drink and her impact on that. And then this student focused on the time in the shower. They were really surprised by how many gallons of water that you use per minute of time. So she was able to go through and each water drop represents a minute. So the showers that were longer had more water drops, the showers that were less had different, and the different days were the different colors, and she drew her shower head. It was really stormy when we actually did this project. So one of my students took that and we were learning about weather and water, and the lightning bolts represent how much water they drank. We did talk about though, like by seeing these, you also have to have some way for people to know the amounts, the people know the scales. So we talked about with this image, how there wasn't a scale, although they did use the water for the extension of the lightning bolt, that there wasn't really a way for people to know how much water that they truly did drink. And the last one that I want to show you, this student has a chore of washing the dishes every night and she hates it. So I was like, well, make it a creative thing. Like, okay, you're collecting data. This is for a school project now. And I had a remark from her parent about how she was more willing to do her chore because it was a school assignment at that point. It was something that she was collecting data on, and she was laughing about her counting the plates and counting the cups and different things that she had washed that evening and creating this sink out of it. So she went through and said the big plate equals 5 plates. And then the medium plate equals 3 plates, and the smaller plate equals 1 plate. And she was able to do the different days. So she has 6 days of data here and how many plates that she did use. So with this planning process, I had a goal in mind. I loved, as I keep saying, the postcard activity that we did at the beginning of this training. And I thought it was the most awesome way to look at data as through different people's eyes and perspectives. And I knew that we were doing a water cycle. So I had to combine the two and put those together. So a quote that I also love from a man named Brian Tracy, he is a motivational speaker, is be clear about your goal, but be flexible about the process of teaching or achieving it. And I know as teachers, we have to be flexible. That's one thing that definitely the pandemic has showed our world about how flexible our teachers are and that we were able to pivot so quickly. So this was really awesome. And the fact that I was like, all right, this is what I need to do. I have to be flexible in this process. And this lesson is definitely one that is flexible, something that you can change. You can change the amount of time. So I do want to talk about the timing of this lesson. It does take a few weeks to do this. It is not something that you can get done in 1 or 2 class periods because it does take about a week for students to gain data. And as I said, you can adjust this. If you have younger students, maybe you make this 1 or 2 days of data. If you have older students, maybe you make this even longer. I was able to do this lesson with my students in 6 class periods. And the reason being that it took so long was I gave them a lot of time for self-exploration. So the first class period that I went into was just breaking it down and trying to go through and ask them, what is water? What is environmental justice? What is data? And then I went even further into like us talking about what water means to them. That actually spilled over into a second class period when we started talking about a question that they could collect data on and how they could collect data. And we did the breakdown of how long it takes to collect data. So after we did that portion, they had a week, which actually ended up spanning into 2 weeks due to like we had a little bit of a holiday break. There were some snow, virtual days, and it just took a lot longer. And that kind of took away from the fire of the lesson, so I would definitely suggest only doing 7 days in between, like giving them a full week. That way it keeps them a little bit more focused, because by the time we came back in 2 weeks, my sixth grade had forgot about it a little bit. Some people had forgot to collect their data. Some people were just randomly scrambling to remember their data. So I would definitely give them a set amount of time if possible. And then after that, we went through, we took an entire class period to look at creative ways. I had them brainstorm ideas, and then they created a final project. And they were able to, that took about 2 class periods for them to fully create their data example and their project. I would love to continue on with this and have them, after we've collected their own data, to then have them go into the community and collect their community data, and then create a community poster portion of this, which was our overall goal. Just unfortunately, with timing and holiday breaks, we didn't get to that portion. So some challenges and changes. Some challenges, as I mentioned prior, is getting students to remember to collect their data. I reminded them every day that I had them, but unfortunately, due to breaks and delays and things, I wasn't able to remind them every day. So at the end of that 2-week period, they weren't able to fully complete it. Also, getting students to think outside the realm of bar graphs and pie charts. I really struggled with students, just getting them to think creatively and getting them to think about something other than the standards that we have drilled into their brain for so long. Some changes that I would make, as I mentioned prior, create some community posters. I would love for them to be able to show our teachers, our students, and our community the things that they're doing and about the water that is within it. The second thing is to add a community data portion. I would love for them to be able to collect data from that and from other people other than themselves. And I would like to allot more time for consistency. As I said, we had breaks, we had things that came up, and we weren't able to completely go through that entire section. A lesson that I definitely learned was my students struggle to think outside of the box. We try to drive creativity and thinking creatively so much, and we talk about engineering for a good part of my year and thinking it through a creative process. But they really did struggle, some of them, to just think of another way to represent this data other than the pie chart, the bar graph, and the scatter plot. And they're like, but Mrs. Patton, this is what we do on labs. I'm like, I know, guys, but think of another way that you could possibly do this for your community. What would they want to see? And I had a few students who creatively made a bar graph. They kind of turned it on their side, stacked it together, or creatively made some sort of scatter plot or pie chart. But I did have a lot of students that did struggle to think outside of that box and think creatively and try to find something else that that they really wanted to do. And that was our major challenge. That was a lesson that I learned, is like, I really need to ease them into creatively thinking about data a little bit more from the beginning of the year, not just at one section. So that was definitely something that I personally learned about my students and about this process through creating this data creatively. I would like to thank you so much for tuning in to my presentation today. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to me. My social media is at Retrievers of Knowledge. You probably heard my retriever in the background. And Patton at carmeria.org. The links for the slide are below for my lesson slides and the lesson plan. If you have any questions, as I said before, please feel free to reach out. I would be happy to hear from you and answer anything that I can. So thank you again, and I hope that you have a wonderful day.